This is the next theory, that is, private property rights determining patterns of productivity. So far, the discussion has focused on intellectual property rights over information goods. However, there are also other incentive mechanisms, as earlier mentioned, which enhance the rate of innovation over information goods. These include, say, prize mechanisms or government procurement methods, as well as common-based methods, which incidentally do not necessarily share the same static inefficiencies that are present in the IP system. In prize systems, an organization, usually the government or a philanthropic organization, offers a financial reward to anyone who creates a certain invention. Though the prize is usually predetermined, there are instances where it's been announced after the invention has come to light as well. However, if it's announced after the invention has come to light, it is usually more difficult to say that this acts as an incentive for that invention to come about. Prize systems are slowly generating renewed interest in information economics today. And of course, this is not unrelated to the growing criticism that the patent system is receiving. More basic research takes place under grants from the government or philanthropic funds, where rather than proprietary rules such as intellectual property, results are shared under norms of open scientific exchange. Similarly, the commons-based approach to creation can be characterized as a production that is based on collaborative approaches rather than proprietary approaches. A good example is that of Wikipedia, where anyone can make or edit an entry, and then this is then peer-reviewed by other volunteers. Similarly is the open source movement, which has been particularly successful in the field of software. So the question now arises that if these other systems may not have the same level of static inefficiencies that are present in the IP system, why do we look at the IP system? To answer this, we have to look at the question from another angle. As the intellectual property regime relies on a marketplace to give out signals, that is market signals, which are then translated by innovative firms or creators or whoever it is making the inventions. They use this information that the market gives them to determine where they want to allocate their inventive resources. Thus, the decentralized system, that is the IP system, it helps direct innovative resources towards maximizing social welfare. We say maximizing social welfare as there is an assumption that consumer demand would determine successes and failures in the market, and by extension, goods that met the most social value, that is, goods that people are most willing to pay for, would be indicated through market signals, and thus market signals would indicate which goods are valued the most on the market. In contrast, for example, in a prize system, the prize setters would be tasked with determining how and where their prize fund could maximize social utility, and the cost of generating such information is extremely high, because generating the amount of data required to come to a conclusion as to what type of good or what type of innovation is most valued or will have the most value is extremely expensive to undertake. Since market signals don't rely on any single entity or any centralized body to generate this information, but rather are in fact signals expressed by the public and hence decentralized, it has been theorized that the efficiency gains in collecting information regarding where innovative resources should be allocated automatically make the IP system more efficient than other type of innovations, despite deadweight losses and other static inefficiencies that may occur with the IP system. Now, this premise has taken a central role in much of the subsequent economic analysis of intellectual property, since this analysis has led to most scholars focusing on trade-offs internal to intellectual property, rather than focusing on IP as one of several different methods of innovation. That is, they look back to the incentive theory to determine what kind of trade-offs internal to the intellectual property system, such as patentability, breadth of a patent, standards of novelty and non-obviousness, patent enforcement, etc. There are also questions of restrictions or limitations to intellectual property, which are often debated in terms of transaction costs, such as preventing the abuse of patent rights, or flexibilities, such as compulsory licenses fair use and copyrights, etc., as the transaction costs involved in the ordinary execution of such exchanges would be too high to allow the information goods to reach the hands of the people who are able and willing to pay for this. However, this assumption that property rights, such as intellectual property rights, will necessarily indicate the best direction for allocation of inventive resources is not necessarily correct. It's useful to look at the differences between physical property rights and intangible or intellectual property rights, which may help to understand why this false assumption may occur. In the case of physical goods, property rights are often seen as the best method of ensuring that physical objects, or land as the case may be, is best made use of, as it is commonly understood that private ownership incentivizes owners to make best use of that property rather than if it were held in the commons, that is, preventing the tragedy of the commons. On the other hand, as the economics of information makes clear, so-called property rights over intangible property are given despite the fact that most efficient use of that information or knowledge is when it is available to the public. Therefore, it does not necessarily flow that owners of IPRs will make best use of the information goods. Neglecting this distinction often undermines the importance of the public goods nature of information. It also thus undermines the importance of the public domain. If the trade-off isn't properly calibrated, there is a danger of allowing deadweight losses to overshadow any dynamic efficiency-based gains. The paradox thus remains. If IP is made stronger than required, you will get clear market signals as to what type of activities are most desired, or rather that people are most willing to pay for. However, granting overly strong IP rights would lead to over-investment in certain market-centric types of products. However, it's not necessarily true that the best use of intangible information is necessarily in market-centric types of products in the first place. Therefore, it is not very clear that market signals will indicate at all whether information or innovative resources should be directed towards goods or towards causes which do not necessarily make an impact on the market, or not directly on the market, such as education, primary research, health of the poor, etc. Moving on to slide number 14. The third major theory, or rather approach, looks into racing issues, or non-coordinate issues, also known as reducing duplication issues. This category looks to reduce economic wastage that can occur in the inventive process through IPRs, and has broadly led to a re-examination of IP as one of the at least three methods of innovation, rather than as a sole determinant of innovative activity. Although questions internal to the IP regimes are still most predominantly discussed in the IP innovation framework, due to, as previously discussed, the patterns of productivity of private property, it is worth noting that there is a small but growing dissent to the premise that IP is a more efficient system than other innovation systems. Looking at the issue of racing, that is, when multiple firms separately expend resources working toward the same goal, two innovation systems, that is the IP system and price systems, could result in a lot of duplicative and wasteful investment, as eventually only one entity will secure the incentive at the end. With regard to racing, government procurement may be more efficient, as this process limits the number of entrants and thus reduces the potential costs of duplicative research. Although it is true that since separate firms undertake the risk of entering into the race for securing the incentive at the end in IP systems and price systems, this overall duplicity which results is often a waste of resources. The other side of this coin is that IP systems and price systems both allow entrants to self-select whether they are suited for that innovative activity. Since entrants are themselves better placed to make use of private information to decide whether they are well suited to competitively invest in allocating their inventive resources towards this incentive goal. If they cannot competitively invest their resources towards this goal, then there are various other types of inefficiencies that can arise, as the financial incentive is awarded or promised upfront and not based on the result. For example, this could lead to delays or low quality work. At the same time, government contracts and price systems face a significant problem. The fund allocator must determine the value of an innovation as well as amongst which innovators the fund must be spread over. If the amount is too small, it won't attract enough entrants. If the amount is too large, it'll be wasteful. If too much of the amount is given to the first innovator, there will be very little incentive to improve upon the product. If the amount is spread amongst too many follow-up participants, there won't be sufficient incentive for the primary innovation. However, recent work on price systems have tinkered with models which do not require the amount to be decided prior to the innovation, but rather after the innovation occurs. These methods could include through the pegging of price allocation based on sales, on perceived value, etc. Thus, with the activity in the information economics space being imported into the economic analysis of IP, there's a slow resurgence of looking at IP as a means to innovation rather than as a goal in itself, placing it in the context of several external factors which affect how normative policy could be affected. Moving on to the conclusion. Slide number 15. To recap so far, the economic analysis of IP is concerned primarily with the utilitarian justification for IP, which states that it is for the greatest good for the greatest number of people. There are three main methods that we use in the IP system. That is the incentive method, which balances incentives with inefficiencies so as to achieve an optimal rate of innovation. Secondly, the diminishing distortions in how markets display consumer needs so as to appropriately direct inventive resources to their most optimal usage in the presence of IP rights. And thirdly, minimizing rent dissipation caused by duplicative research. There are at least three broad conclusions that can be drawn looking at this thus far. Firstly, that it is not clear that higher or stronger levels of IP lead to higher rates of innovation. As discussed earlier, it is possible that the inefficiencies start outweighing the dynamic efficiencies if IP is made too strong. At the same time, if it is made too weak, there will not be dynamic efficiency to start with. Secondly, countries of different socio-economic statuses should approach IP in ways that are appropriate to their domestic capabilities. And thirdly, IP should be kept within the pot of larger socio-economic issues. And with this, we conclude our chapter on the economics of IP.